How did you come to the professional field of sex education and what was your professional career?
Hello, my name is Naomi Price Lazarus. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a sex educator. I'm based in Seattle, Washington, and I run a small nonprofit called Papaya Project, which has the mission of creating opportunities for people of all ages to access workshops and educational programming around comprehensive sex education and social emotional learning. I came to this field of sex education over the course of a few years, working out of educational spaces, nonprofit spaces, and doing a lot of social justice oriented programming. I have a background in women's and gender studies. That's what I studied in my undergraduate degree at Carleton College, which I graduated from in 2018. And after college, I moved to France to become a teacher for a year. And then I worked at a nonprofit doing a lot of volunteer coordination and community organizing with a variety of different populations of folks. I moved back to Seattle, which is where I'm from, in 2020, and found a position doing social emotional learning in public schools. And so in that position, I was teaching mostly middle school students, which for us is ages 11 to 14 or so, where I was teaching them during COVID, doing a lot of virtual teaching and some in-person teaching with youth, and found during that period of time, as we were talking a lot about trauma, that there was also not space for youth to talk about gender identity and exploration and to discuss relationships, consent, sexuality, pleasure, etc. So I ended up shifting my work into teaching sex education, adored it, and eventually got my certification from the Institute for Sexuality, Education, and Enlightenment, shortened to IC, which is one of the few options for getting sex ed certifications in the United States. So I'm now a certified sex educator working towards a final accreditation that I hope to achieve from ASECT, which is the American Association for Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. So my career has kind of woven through a path of, like I said, gender studies, sexuality studies, kind of an interest in sociology and understanding how the world works and frames and understands pleasure, and also then seeing kind of the lack thereof of comprehensive sex education and opportunities, particularly for youth, to be understanding their bodies in a way that is shame-free, consent-focused, and liberationary, right? I want youth to think of this as, and for all people to think of sex education as something that is intersectional, so related to all systems of oppression and injustices, and also think about it as an axis through which they can explore all parts of their identities and come into themselves with more confidence, more curiosity, and hopefully more pleasure.
What do you think are the challenges as a sex educator?
As to the second question, what do you think are the challenges a sex educator might face? Speaking from my own experience, the main challenge that I have as a sex educator, rather than somebody who's a therapist, is that there is not a lot of job opportunities or job security. Running my own business, I have found that I need to advocate for myself all the time and do a lot of communications and networking to try to convince schools that this is a topic that needs to be addressed, even though it is state required in Washington State for public schools. For example, private schools in Washington State do not have to teach sex ed. They're on their own standards. So I've been working in a lot of private schools teaching, but even if they agree that sex education is important, they often keep it on the back burner, meaning they often don't make it a priority, or they do the minimal things that they think they need to do, which is teach about STIs, teach about contraceptives, prevention methods, maybe about reproduction, or puberty and menstruation, right? But really keeping it more to the scientific element, often a subject in the United States that is taught by PE teachers or health teachers who are otherwise talking about substances, right? Like alcohol and drugs. So it often has more of like either a directly just health mindset or a fear-based mindset when it comes to thinking about risk factors and reducing risks of STIs, which of course is important, right? But there's less of a focus on thinking of consent as something that is integrated into all parts of our lives all the time, or as sexuality as something that people explore out of curiosity and because they want to feel good. And so I think that like lack of understanding or disconnection between what we as sex educators often want to be bringing to the forefront, which is that this is a very multifaceted and wide-reaching subject, is then reduced down to sex, as in sex that can cause pregnancy, sex that can cause STIs, right? Sex that is something to be feared or something like that can only be discussed within a lot of these like very strict boundaries. So that disconnection, right, that misunderstanding, and I think that's evolving, but is slow to evolve, makes it hard to get work. There are hardly any positions for sex educators in full-time capacities, whether that's in schools or outside of schools. For myself running a business, it's been really hard to not only get clients, which tend to be schools, but then to have them believe that I should be teaching more than 2 hours, but actually that I can teach 25 hours on sex education. I did just finish a gig where I taught 25 hours over the course of 2 weeks to the same group of 15 youth. It was incredible, right? But those opportunities are few and far between. And I guess just to add to that last question, I think there's just a lack of cultural legitimacy or societal legitimacy given to sex education as a field, because it's not something everybody's familiar with or people like to make jokes about it, and because there's so much shame and stigma that there's a lot of like needing to prove why what I do is important, and not a lot of equitable or highly regarded, highly compensated pay when it actually comes to the work itself. And this is really different from therapists, because people who are sex and relationship therapists have a lot more job security. It's something that insurance recognizes. It's something that societally is more and more common. And so educators kind of have this role that gets disregarded within all of that, even though education and therapy have a large crossover. I would say therapists are often educators as well. And educators are doing a lot of the work that is going to help people be able to access resources like therapy. So I see them as intricately intertwined, but unfortunately not seen the same way in our societies.
How do you help people understand and respect their sexual boundaries?
When it comes to helping people understand and respecting their sexual boundaries, a lot of that comes through consent education and through, I would say, people kind of giving themselves permission to explore their own pleasure and to practice boundary setting, to be able to then know what their limits are, to know what their desires are. With adult education in particular, so teaching outside of schools to people over the age of 18, I like to focus more on helping people understand what do they actually want, right? What do they want sexually? Where are their limits, right? What are their triggers if they have different kind of sexual traumas that they should be aware of? How can they communicate those? And so much of it is self-knowledge and confidence building in believing that you have the right to know your body and you have the right to tell and communicate to other people, this is a thing that I like, this is a thing that I don't like, and this is a thing I maybe like. There's something called the yes, no, maybe list, which can be a really helpful activity for people to think about things that are what we call hard no's, hard yeses, and then in that maybe category where maybe it's context dependent, time dependent, relationship dependent. And so all of these different kind of aspects of ourselves and tools we can use can help people understand and respect their sexual boundaries, right? Understand what their interests are, understands what their interests aren't, and understand where they might have space for exploration. Consent, of course, is in all of this. It's really great to look at BDSM, for example, and the kink community as kind of being at the forefront of our consent movement and making consent really the basis of all the ways that we engage in communication and in sexual play. And I think we have a lot to learn from that societally, whether or not a person chooses to engage in kink and BDSM. When it comes to youth, sometimes people under 18 have a harder time just given lack of experience or lack of maturity or the spaces in which I'm educating where there's limits, right? Talking actually about what does different desire look like, right? What is spontaneous versus responsive desire, which is a great way to help adults often think about kind of how they even know what turns them on. And Come As You Are, a book by Emily Nagoski, is a really great resource for looking into that. So for youth, it's a little bit more to thinking about what are things that bring you joy, what are things that don't, And how do you practice knowing in your body and then communicating when you are no longer enjoying something? Where is it safe to do so? How can you build safety for yourself? And how can you create safety for other people in saying no and in creating boundaries that don't come across as feeling offensive, or not interpreting boundaries as being a no to everything or a rejection of a person, right? But instead, a demonstration that that person actually feels comfortable enough to be able to communicate with you in the first place.
What current developments or topics are shaping sex education?
There are a lot of current developments in the sex education world. Some things that I personally am aware of, so I can't speak to even like the United States as a whole, but I would say current developments in my own understanding and what I want to bring into the classroom is one of them is an idea about compulsory sexuality. So the idea that every person is by nature sexual or sexually oriented, which is a really helpful framework, I think, for discussing sexual orientation and understanding asexuality and the kind of scales at which the spectrum at which people approach sexuality and its importance that it plays in their life and in their personal development. I think that a lot of media puts forth the idea that every person is and should be sexual in a certain way, and that it can kind of control their lives in a certain way or control their relationships, or at least guide them. And I think that that's not necessarily helpful in allowing people to figure out how and when and if they ever want to be sexual with somebody else or with themselves. So I think compulsory sexuality is one really great kind of newer thing that's being increasingly discussed. Developments in the United States cannot mention the fact that I can't skip the fact that we have a lot of states that are also increasingly limiting access to contraceptive health care, to abortion access, and limiting the amount of education and discussions that students can even have within schools around LGBTQI identities, around trans rights, around all gender bathrooms, right? We have a lot of legislation in a lot of different states that's currently in process. And then we have states like Florida that have the don't say gay policy, where teachers can be fired for saying the word gay within the school environment, right? Or schools where there's large amounts of banned books. So students can't even access resources that could help answer their questions. States like Utah that are trying to limit students' access or young people's access to social media accounts without parental permission, but we know that those can also be great sources for education if used wisely. So statewide decision-making and policies are a big part of kind of the current discussion and debate around sex education, which pulls back from being able to even think about having a conversation about compulsory sexuality and asexuality, right? If a youth is not even able to access information on LGBTQ rights or allowed to feel comfortable using the bathroom of their gender identity within their home communities. So there's a lot of great new research, a lot coming out about orgasm, about polyamory, about alternative relationship styles and different ways to love and attachment styles. All of that is fantastic. And a lot of that is also like more discussed within the adult population. And because I try to focus on youth, it feels like with youth, there's really just also the basic fight for the right to have comprehensive sex education within schools that is not abstinence only, that is LGBTQ inclusive, and that is culturally responsive and accepts intersectional viewpoints within its framework.
How can we improve the way we deal with sexual issues in schools and daycare centers?
For question number 5, how can we improve the way we deal with sexual issues in schools and daycare centers? I think it depends on what you mean by sexual issues. So if you want to send a more specific question on that, you can. I'll share just some thoughts coming up for me. I think when it comes to schools and daycare centers, they're for any age, when youth are being supervised by adults, there should be education and there should be accountability when it comes to helping youth learn about consent and helping youth understand boundary setting. That is something that can start in preschool and should go through high school and beyond. And so when it comes to having policies within school environments, for instance, that are hopefully able to address what happens when a student experiences sexual assault, right? Who did they go to? What are the repercussions? How is the legal system involved, if at all? How are the police involved, if at all? We also have something called mandatory reporting in the United States, where people who are school employees are required to report incidences of self-harm or of harming others to the legal system. So I don't know if that relates to where you live, but I would say in terms of improving how we deal with sexual issues, we need to have the education in the first place. We need to have consent education. We need to teach boundary setting. We also need to respect boundaries. Youth grow up not knowing oftentimes that they have a voice and that they can set boundaries because they legally don't have maybe the right to consent when it comes to sexuality. That's age dependent, statewide. State by state in the United States, usually varying from 16 to 18 years old is the legal age to consent to sex. But I would also say just because they're taught that they need to follow the rules or there will be repercussions. That is how our institutions work on an institution-wide basis, whether that's schools or the criminal system or work environments. There's hierarchies and there's repercussions for not following rules. And so being able to engage youth in understanding what that means is really helpful, and knowing where they do have the capacity to say no, even to people who are in power. And then I think teaching the basics of respect and limiting misogynistic, racist, and other violent language that withholds or upholds systems of oppression and derogatory uses of words that can harm people severely, right? So a lot of kind of those basic things that are taught to young children, I think need to be retaught to older people as well, all the way through high school and beyond. So I would say to kind of break that down, to increase kind of our discussion of sexuality and maybe what happens around sexuality within these spaces, more consent education, more boundary setting, more respect, access to resources on campus, access to reproductive health care resources, right? Free condoms, whatever that might look like. And then policies in place to understand very clearly what are the repercussions so that students know what could happen and also who they can turn to if something does happen that crosses boundaries.